So Nate, if you haven't seen Nate before or met him before, actually was a presenter at our conference last year. So really great to have somebody back and returning with us. But Nate's a seasoned leader with over 2 decades of product experience, got a diverse background, lots of different experience working as both a founder at startups, scale-ups, and large companies, including Amazon, Drift, and now at Madison Logic. He's a constant learner and passionate mentor. You'll find him regularly learning something new about product and probably new about something in general. And we're really excited to have Nate back again this year, again, like as I mentioned, for participating in this event and conference. Thanks, Jane.
Amazing. Can I share my screen? Let's see.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go through, we only have 30 minutes together, and I wanted to talk specifically about the importance of risk. It's something I'm super passionate about. I actually have a hobby in options trading that I've practiced in the past because I love risk and tail risk so much, and I think it has so much to tell us from a product management perspective. So I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to see how much we can get covered over the next few minutes. So fundamentally, what I want to talk about is that risk is, at the end of the day, about analyzing your tail risk. And so you need to think about how you make decisions in terms of the downside risk and the upside potential of your choices. And so when you look at the priorities that you want to cover, it actually pays not just to do an assessment at the quantitative level. A lot of us in product are used to saying, what is the risk of this A/B test? What are the KPIs that I am running? Is there enough upside? Is it statistically significant? And have I met my guardrail metrics? Have I actually looked at the metrics that I am monitoring to make sure that there's zero downside impact so that I know that I'm good to launch the test? And we kind of stop our risk assessment in that quantitative world. And so what I want to suggest is that we need to think about risk a little bit more comprehensively. And we need to think about it not just in terms of product features that we launch, but in terms of product lines and commercial strategy. And so we need to think about it as a particular product is also effectively a test that we are running within a larger commercial context. And the metrics are often not as clear-cut as you get with A/B testing. And as a result, you need to start to think about risk and formulate risk in both quantitative and qualitative terms. One of the things that I think is very tempting in a lot of product organizations is to over-quantify the metrics and say, our pilot will be successful if, and then we define like a number of pilot participants, or we define a particular KPI set that we're going to meet. What I see happening a lot in product orgs is that because we have defined it ostensibly quantitatively, we think that we have done the priorities work that we need to do. We think that we have defined the long-term edge that we think we're going to get in the marketplace and can measure that. And we find as we get into the pilot, inevitably, that we learn things we didn't expect. And we often find that we see launch pressures emerge to push a product out into market, even if a particular set of pilot KPIs wasn't met, because there's a larger commercial argument to be made. And so what I'm trying to suggest here is that we need to expand our understanding of risk in our toolkit so that we can actually understand the full picture of risk that we're operating in, and we are less surprised when leaders make commercial or narrative-based arguments for launching or not launching a product, and we learn to assess that for ourselves proactively. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead. I think this is going to work better here. Let's see. I want to talk about the toolbox that we use, right? So quantitative bets, reading the table, smart bluffing. I'm having fun with the gambling metaphor with bets because it's just a fun way to play with Midjourney. It's a fun way to talk about this in a way that's, I think, accessible, right? Like we can all imagine James Bond in the casino making his bets in a Bond movie. And we find that we ourselves are living in that world. We find that the quantitative bets that we make are bets that depend on the same kinds of probabilities that you see in a casino environment. So if you look at what you need to do in these movies with betting, it's all about reading your hand, reading the table, learning to bluff. I see some of those same parallels in the toolbox for good PMs. Good PMs know when to talk about a product that isn't there yet, but will be there, and that they can make a case for and make a case as if it exists to a strategic client and start to build toward that goal. That's really bluffing. And there's a case for bluffing too far. You bluff ahead of your capabilities too far, and you're going to get into trouble. We've all had the situation, or many of us probably have, where sales teams will actually sell vaporware, right? They'll sell something that doesn't exist and then ask the product team to come back and build it. A proactive PM can actually get ahead of that a little bit by anticipating what clusters of customers will need, whether you're in a B2B context or a B2C context, and suggesting we could build this, and then trying those lightweight prototypes or lightweight demos that actually enable you to start to bluff your way into success. And I have seen that in the B2C context as well, where people will put up essentially landing pages that indicate interest, and they will test the waters and see what they can get from a consumer point of view. If you want to talk about other aspects, we talked a little bit, at the top there about how risk needs to be understood in a larger context, in a commercial and a strategic context, as well as a quantitative context. We've talked a little bit about how to look at risk from a product timeline perspective. Like, how do you gauge ahead and lean over your skis just a little bit when you are building a product so that you can bring the product into the market with a narrative and get feedback on it by showing demos, for example. I also want to call out that all of this depends on a very strong contextual understanding of your business and of the metrics that drive the business. Successful PMs that are able to move ahead of their product in narrative, that are able to understand the context they operate in strategically, are PMs who understand the metrics that move the business. And I often find that PMs get very involved in feature level metrics, and it can be challenging to paint the dots and connect the numbers to drive that up to a business level metric or a larger product level metric that actually like a CEO or C-suite would pay attention to. And if you have too much of a dislocation there, it's not that you can measure everything on the same metric, but if you have too much of a dislocation there, you have trouble understanding where the beating heart of your business is. And that in turn leads to misunderstanding of the real risks in play when you put a bet down on the board. So, for example, if you are trying to get a feature launched, you need to figure out how to articulate the value of that feature, not just in terms of the immediate metrics it drives, but also in terms of a larger strategic theme. And that gets into some of the daily betting tips. I didn't want to leave this conversation without really focusing on what we can do day to day to actually level up our understanding of risk. Number one for me is really bet sizing. If you are understanding the scale of impact you plan to make, and you are understanding the amount of investment that you plan to put in, whether that's in developer terms or whether that's in monetary terms, you are effectively engaged in figuring out how many poker chips you're going to push onto the table for a particular bet. And to do that smartly, you need to figure out what your probability of success is in the commercial space you operate in. And there are often defined playbooks that work. So for example, in the SaaS market with B2B, you often have a playbook that operates where the business first tries to establish a foothold at the small, medium business level in a particular niche. From there, it has two directions to expand. It expands up the market into enterprise, and it expands sideways into related verticals. At the board level, that is what drives valuation changes. And when you are launching a feature, you need to understand to what degree your bet is going to influence that larger strategy in order to correctly understand the size of the bet. And so if you are putting down a bet that may seem small, but is actually a first foray into a new total addressable market, the upside and downside impact of that bet may be much larger than the amount of developer hours you put into it. Conversely, if you're launching a very expensive feature upgrade, like for example, you are wiring in a deep Salesforce integration, you need to realize that even though you are doing that, the outcome or value that you get may not be as great if it's just operating inside the existing business model. And so in a sense, that may be a much lower risk bet with a much heavier buy-in. When you're thinking about all of this, one of the key things that I want to call out is that you need to understand when to cut bait or when to walk away. One of the things that most product and tech teams that I've worked with struggle at is how to sunset and how to walk away from products and features. And so we get into a situation where we are committed to this success. We PMs believe in this success. We want it to be true. And we launch it with the best of intentions. Let's say we correctly size the bet. We understand our commercial strategy. We understand the KPIs in play. And we put it out there. And we know there's odds, right? It's never going to be 100% sure success rate. And in this case, it doesn't come up in our favor and the market doesn't take it. We don't get the product market fit we were looking for. I have built features personally where our customers have sworn to me that they will use this feature, that they love it, that they want it. So I built it. I put it out in the market. And nobody used it. It was dead. It was dead on arrival. It was like 5% of the usage rate that we expected. And I think that the temptation in those cases is to double down, right? Maybe one more feature will fix this, is the thing we tell ourselves. And it opens up many more options if you are in a space where you can deliberately say, this didn't work. We are going to pause support for this. We are going to pause development on this. In some cases, we may sunset this, because we want to really double down on something new and try a new bet. And ideally, since you have been understanding, the larger commercial picture you're operating in, the larger strategic picture you're operating in, you can actually paint the picture of what you learned in a failed bet in a way that makes sense in a larger narrative. And so you can say, look, we tried this, it didn't work. That taught us X or Y about the market, and therefore we are trying Z. Like the next piece we're going to try is Z. And so that gets you into this sense that you are actually deliberately exploring a strategic space with the product, and you have a ability to explore that's limited in linear time, but you can go anywhere you want if you're patient with the linear time. And so it's just about being smart about where you take the next bet and explaining the narrative of how you get there. One of the mental models that I use for that is actually understanding how fungi work to explore mazes. There's scientists that actually use fungi to explore mazes, and fungi are really amazing at going toward a reward source, a nutrient source at the center of a maze, and they just deliberately explore and they cut down and stop strands of fungi that are not finding nutrients, and they move toward strands that are finding more success, and they're able to actually drive mazes that way. And that reminds me of smart product betting strategies where we explore a space, we pause if it doesn't work, and then we go on and explore what does work. And so that brings in sort of how you look at bet sizing and how you look at when to go all in. In this year, in 2023, and I think I talked about this very briefly in the sort of the little paragraph at the top there, where we talk about what we'll cover. Betting big is really scary in 2023. And in most cases, this is a year when small bites at the apple are going to deliver more reward, not just from a career perspective, but also for the business. If you can make a small improvement that rings the cash register today, or this month, or this quarter, you would rather be doing that than making a really big bet into an uncertain economy. And so part of that really gets at assessing where the reward is. And the real kicker is that because interest rates are changing, because earnings have been up and down, you don't really know from a consumer perspective, you don't even know from a business perspective exactly where your prospective customers will be when your bet comes to life in a longer time frame, in 6 months, in 9 months. You don't really know, and it's a very uncertain time. A lot of the underlying macroeconomic factors are changing. And so when you're assessing the pot, when you're assessing the value you get out of a big bet right now, you are actually needing to assess it as a probability or as a range rather than as a set quantity. Because at the end of the day, you don't really know where the macro factors are going to be. And that uncertainty is significant enough that I would suggest in most cases, you are going to get a lot less risk delivering something smaller, quicker, that hits the bottom line right away. And it's not as fun as product people, right? Like when you're talking about what you love to do as a product person, it's all about, I built a big new thing, I launched it, it had a real impact and it moved the needle. We all love that narrative. This is a time when you get to tell a different story in your career. You get to tell the story of how you were aware of the macro factors. You built stuff that was durable. You built stuff that improved business as usual. You optimized, and you really delivered improvements in cash flow in this year. And those kinds of stories actually work really well in hiring markets. They work really well inside businesses right now, because every CEO is thinking about, how can I make sure I have a cash position that's solid so that I protect the business regardless of the uncertainty up ahead. And so when they look at product teams and product bets, they're looking at it kind of in cash terms, like, what is my ROI on this and how soon can I realize it? And so they have that uncertainty model. And the more you sort of recognize that and assess that, the more you'll understand that they're looking at tail risk as really high right now. They're looking at this being an event that is unusual in the marketplace. And those nasty outcomes are more likely right now than they have been in past years. And so it's important to be in a position where you are building that, what we call the house betting edge, where, like the saying in Las Vegas is, the house always wins, because they tilt the game. So the probability is always in favor of the casino, not the player. In this case, you want to be building product advantages that put you in a position where your bets are low enough risk that you're gaining on most of them. And so you're driving, even if it's not super big, you're driving optimizations that really matter. So with that in mind, I want to tell you a story. This is from Prime Video, and it shows an example of how you can, quote unquote, hit the jackpot and still be in a position of optimizing, because I think that's kind of the line we're all walking. When I walked into Prime Video, we had a broken Windows problem. So if you look across the Prime Video storefront a few years ago, back in, say, 2018, 2019, you would often see gray boxes with smiley faces on them. Those gray boxes were the placeholder images where we had no artwork from the studio to show a thumbnail. So you would know that, hey, you know, Friends is Friends if you're watching the TV show, or the latest Marvel movie is actually the latest Marvel movie. That's relevant in Prime Video's case because we had a 1 million title catalog. It keeps getting bigger. And we had a huge number of titles that were not as famous as the ones I just described, where artwork was hard to come by. Studios had shot these back in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and we knew it was core to our selection strategy to present them, but we also knew that studios literally didn't have the artwork to give us to display those titles. They just had the actual content and the title of the film or the title of the show. So it was my job to basically take the fact that our suppliers wouldn't give us artwork, take the fact that it really mattered to consumers to be able to discover the title, put those together, and with a fairly lean team, figure out how to solve it. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up conceptualizing it in terms of autonomy for the Prime Video catalog display team. So right now, like when I walked into the role, we were not in charge of our destiny on the artwork front. We had to depend on studios like Paramount or Disney to give us artwork in order to display it to our customers. We had no other levers. And so strategically, the way I sold this to executives was, we need to have autonomy. We need to have our own levers to independently drive artwork coverage so we can deliver for customers regardless of where studios are at on a particular title. And we know studios care about new titles. I have no doubt they're going to be delivering us great artwork for what's coming this year. But for what was coming 15 years ago, we weren't getting the attention. We weren't getting the time. They didn't have the art. That particular frame was tuned not just to the actual needs in the product space, which is true. Like we needed some kind of independent lever to move the needle on the product. But you should also realize that from a risk perspective, I was showing executives how to de-risk the experience for consumers so that they could actually pick the title and be confident they picked the right title. And executives could know that they had title coverage regardless of where studios were at. And that is a cultural value at Amazon. And so I was tuning it both to the risk picture, I was tuning it to the product situation, and I was tuning that narrative to the Amazonian culture. At that point, when I had the green light to move forward, I actually looked at how I could move forward in pieces. I did an experimental test with a machine learning model that would read a film identify core images in that film, pull those up, and actually give a human in the loop, give a person operating the end interface a choice of images to present as a title image. And so what we got at the end was a title image drawn from the actual film. It was a still from the film, and we laid the title over the top. I didn't know if that would work. I didn't know if the image recognition algorithm would work. I didn't know if the filters that we had to put on the top of it to make sure there was not inappropriate content in the title image would work. I didn't know if we would be able to generate enough candidate images from enough titles that this was actually scalable. And so the way I framed it was, this is a walk, this is a crawl, walk, run. We're going to crawl by experimenting and see if this works at all. We're going to validate it with quantitative metrics that measure the accuracy and precision of the machine learning model and the throughput improvements for humans who are uploading title information. And once we hit those metrics, we will actually get to move into scaling up the production pipeline, starting to scale up accuracy and precision based on the feedback we're getting from the people involved, and starting to actually fully automate. All of that worked because those metrics were tied into the business needs. So I set it up at the top as the business needs an autonomous lever, and then I was able to sell the optimization thread as this is a machine learning driven way to actually close those gaps where studios are unable to give us artwork. There's a lot more detail in that, but the big picture takeaway is that you can actually get to significant wins. I actually was able to mostly eliminate the broken windows issue. I think we went from 30-some% of streams involving broken windows to 0.5% to 1%, depending on where you are in the world. And that came from that optimization mindset. Okay, what happens? I've got like 6 minutes. I'm gonna see if I can give you one more quick story. What happens when you want to double down, right? What happens when you want to actually go farther on something? This is a very different context. It's not direct to consumer, it's in the B2B space. At the time, Drift was really focused on making sure that their marketer portfolio of products was mature so that they could drive higher contract values, larger net dollar retention, and ultimately drive the valuation of the business. My responsibility within that commercial context was to make sure that I was setting a product roadmap that emphasized polish and emphasized tools for scale for enterprise customers. Because we were doubling down in the marketer portfolio, and we knew that that was our most mature customer set and therefore had the most expansion opportunity from a revenue perspective. And so that meant that the bets I needed to make actually needed to be very different. They needed to be high probability bets with a large disproportionate payoff. So I found things like WCAG accessibility compliance, where I knew that larger customers would need to make sure their chatbots were accessible, and I needed to prioritize building to that in order to make sure that we actually have a fully compliant platform to enable large enterprise contracts. There were other elements as well. There was an element of reducing the cost it took to maintain and drive chatbots with like a lot of back-end improvements. So it was easier to maintain a large library of chatbots, easier to manage them, easier to integrate them with other systems of record. None of that is super glamorous. Some of that isn't even visible to the end user. But at the end of the day, we were prioritizing bets on the board that would enable us to rapidly expand our valuation and really double down on this particular core customer we were going after. And so because I didn't have a particular frame for I have to do X or Y, I was able to understand the commercial strategy in place, ladder that into the product effectively, and really make sure that the roadmap tightly drove against those larger strategic goals. All right, I see we are at 9:27. We have just a couple more slides. I want to talk briefly about what it's like a level up. So I've tried to sort of illustrate how there's really tightly connective tissue between the strategic goals a business will have at the executive layer and what individual PMs need to be thinking about as they work on it. And I fully admit that as an individual PM, that context has not always been clear to me, and I've had to learn the value of it the hard way. And the connective tissue is the PM leader. And I see that now sort of sitting in the role I'm sitting in my last few roles. If PM leadership is not actively giving the strategic context to frontline product managers. It is really hard for frontline product managers to set up product portfolios that are tuned to success. And so when you are actually building a team, we talk a lot about the importance of building the right team, balancing strengths, making sure you bring in the right mix of experience levels on product teams. We talk less about the importance for product leaders to make sure that they are a really solid bridge between the strategic context the business is operating at and the risks and bet assessments that individual product managers are making on a regular basis. And if they're unable to articulate that, what you find is that product leaders either don't understand the commercial strategy, and so they articulate a product roadmap that's not in alignment with the larger goals of the business, and that leads to dislocation, confusion, spin across the product org. Or they understand it, but there's a communication chasm. They're not sort of telling that story clearly to the PMs in a way they can understand, and then PMs can get frustrated because they bring up features, they bring up roadmap ideas, and it's like, no, 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 no. And you wonder why, right? Like, what am I not getting? I assessed the value of this feature correctly from a quantitative perspective. Why is the business not interested in it? And so the way to address that is actually, if you're in an IC role, to ask to sit down with your leader and ask to understand what the business priorities are if you don't understand them yet. Like, ask for that session actively, ask for it for your team. And if you're a leader, it's really a call to communicate clearly. Make sure that you are reinforcing that value and communicating narrative change as it happens. So if the business is refocusing on X or Y in the new quarter, take the time to explain the commercial context, to explain the why, and explain where some of that is going to hit from a blast radius perspective across your PM team. Having that communication up front allows your PMs to understand the context, size their bets appropriately, and really move forward. So I think with that in mind, I will just hop to the end because I see that we are at 9:30, and we will call it good.
Awesome. Thank you, Nate. Really great session. Really, really great session. I'm just going to see by lots of applause here too coming through. We'll definitely take some questions in the Slack. Encourage you to reach out to Nate. He's obviously, available in lots of different channels and places. And we look forward to hopefully maybe getting some opportunities to talk into this topic a little bit deeper.
I'd love to do that. It's something, as you can tell, that I'm super passionate about, Scott. So thanks so much for having me. Lovely to chat. Please do reach out by Slack or social.
Sounds great. Thank you.